Welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, a podcast designed to blend information, resources, and collaboration to energize your practice and your life. I'm your host, Dr. Ray Christner, and we are going to take a deep dive into all things mental health. My experience, passion, and a bit of luck has provided me with incredible opportunities. Of these, what strikes me the most are the many conversations where I hear not only the information that others have to share, but their passion behind it. On this podcast, I'm looking to bring you this same experience. We'll talk with experts, practitioners, each other, and most importantly, you. Now, get ready. Let's get psyched to practice. Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of the Psyched to Practice podcast. Paul and I are doing another duo episode today.
Yeah, no, we're really excited. And today we have an extensive topic. I think, we're talking about beliefs, blind spots, and biases, and, how they are this universal experience, but really what the impact that they can have in terms of mental health in a variety of ways.
Yeah, and extensive is definitely the word for this episode because as you all will hear, it's going to extend into multiple episodes, which for me was actually kind of exciting. This has been a thought-provoking topic for me, and not necessarily new information, but information that made me, rethink about things that I already knew. And, with that, kind of my takeaway, I guess, for this episode today was really just the impact of biases and how pervasive they are through all aspects of our life, whether it's, things that we do socially, whether it's professional decisions or politics or our likes of pop culture things. Everything kind of gets influenced by potential biases we have. And so thinking about them and I guess bringing them back into my awareness has been fun.
Yeah. And, we get into a really interesting conversation. And I think it's probably the takeaway that I have, which is that, we have such a negative view, and even just the word bias, I have a negative connotation, and how with them being so prevalent, it's not a positive or a negative thing. It's, they are just something that exists, and then it's up to us to do with them, what we will. And I think it comes down again to that awareness piece, but how they can serve really valuable purpose, especially in therapy. And it's something that it definitely stood out for me.
Yeah, it was something I don't think I had thought about before we started recording. And I think that just kind of came up organically, but is definitely something as we keep talking about these, I'm going to keep in mind. And for all of you listening, as always, we would love to hear from you and what your takeaways are from this episode. Please keep in touch and share your thoughts on all major social media.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this practice in action episode on beliefs, blind spots, and biases.
Well, Paul, we're here again for another duo episode, and this actually is kind of an interesting topic for me. So, we're going to really kind of focus on this idea of beliefs, blind spots, and biases. And I think that with everything that goes on in the world today, we see biases all the time. So interesting to have an episode.
Definitely a topical conversation, that's for sure. And with that, we're thinking of having a specific format for today that we're going to be explaining each specific bias that we're covering, and then really kind of hearing one another's thoughts about the process, whether that's professional, personal, or somewhere in between.
Sounds fun.
Well, and I guess to start, wondering, we've been on this topic and we've been trying to do some preparation here. But Ray, for you, what got you interested in talking about biases, and what why are we talking about it today for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this topic's come up for a lot of reasons. Again, just things that we see in the world every day. But, for me, I think it's interesting. I've known about biases probably longer than I knew I wanted to be a psychologist. So I actually kind of got into biases as part of a philosophy class when I was in undergrad and was doing some research. And it actually wasn't even on biases. It was about being a skeptic. And I came across this article that's still, I think, pretty relevant today. And it's by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. People may know Daniel Kahneman because he's done, I think, a bunch of TED Talks at this point. So, he's out there. They wrote this article back in like 1974 called Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. It was the first time I actually heard the word cognitive biases. And so reading it was interesting because it made me, I think, look at myself and go, wait a second, like, am I biased in how I think about things and how I'm processing information? And so I got really interested in it. And I think, as we develop as critical thinkers, right, we more and more, I think, have to pay attention to those things. So it started for me like way back, and I think about them all the time. How about for you?
Yeah, I mean, bias it's such a common word, I think, to get thrown around. And right. For the longest time, I really thought of myself as like, I'm not biased. I'm self-aware.
Sure.
And then I think really for me, that change came in my graduate program in a diversity class, and talking about just the idea of privilege, and the role that it plays and how, when we have privilege and we're not aware of that privilege, then we have biases, and then we judge others based off different criteria. And like that really took me aback. And, I am a young, white, cisgendered, heterosexual male. And so I have all the privilege. And, thinking of it in those terms, it really tried to pull me out of my perspective and just trying to have a larger worldview approach rather than just kind of that first person perspective that I was really approaching things. And so for me at that point, it really brought this idea of biases to life, and have been trying to be aware of it, certainly stumbling my way at times, but trying to be aware of it as we go on and trying to use that information to make better informed decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. We're going to have kind of focusing today on this idea of cognitive bias, but kind of your exposure coming from this idea of a social perspective and how these cognitive biases, I think, influence us. And you're right. I think this is a word people say all the time, and I'm not sure all the time they know what they're kind of referring to. So when you're saying cognitive bias, like how do you define it? What is that for you?
I would say like the concept that I hold for it is really just shortcuts. It's the idea that I try to make shortcuts, whether that's in the way that I process information and in the judgments that I make, or in the decision-making process. And so being able to kind of rely on those without really questioning ends up being a concern. And, I think certainly we see that take place when we're in like performance art where, individuals with sleight of hand or optical illusions, sure, we have a perception that isn't being seen as reality. And right, we can, we're left mystified, but really, we have these biases of how things should go. And when they don't, we're then left being thrown off. And so being able to try to grow and expand our awareness of that, I think it ends up having us be better informed thinkers. But, that's, I think at the core of it is it just becomes a shortcut and in some ways maybe offers us a security. How about for you though?
Yeah. So one, I like kind of how you refer to it as shortcuts. I kind of see it the same way. And I think your reference to illusion is really important because, I think in those situations, at some point we know it's not real, and we can kind of look at that differently. I think sometimes we don't do that with our own thoughts, though. Like, so from the outside, we can look and go, okay, yeah, we know the guy is not floating someone over a table. But we don't necessarily, I think, when we're thinking about our own thoughts, do that well. And so for me, maybe my kind of definition is maybe a little bit more formal, but I kind of start with the idea. I think it's something that we're often unaware of. Like I don't always think biases are purposeful. I think sometimes we're not even paying attention to them. But then beyond that, I think it's, our thoughts, there are buried beliefs that we don't want to acknowledge sometimes. There are prejudices, all of those things. So basically any of these things we're unaware of that influence our decisions. I think that's kind of a simple definition for me. And I think we're better thinkers when we are aware of them. I know I catch myself all the time, whether it's professional or personal, it's easy to slip into those shortcuts in thinking. And so I think awareness is maybe number one in how we deal with them.
Yeah. Well, with that, why don't we get into talking about some of the specific biases that we fall prey to? And the first one here is going to be the confirmation bias.
Okay.
And I think of all of them, like that's probably the one that, if I'm thinking about a bias, that's one of the first ones that comes to mind. But, for the sake of a shared understanding, when we're talking about the confirmation bias here, we're talking about something that involves having favorite thoughts or focusing on information that confirms our existing beliefs or preconceptions. We're predisposed to discount information that doesn't really confirm our belief system. And so when we're talking about this idea, Ray, for you, if you can think what professionally, personally, how has the confirmation bias impacted you?
Yeah, I think we see this everywhere. I mean, it's, for me, as you were reading it, I think, probably where I'm seeing maybe the impact the most now is just how pervasive it is on the internet and social media, where we may have a thought and, whatever algorithms they use, it seems like they're able to find what we believe and to just keep reinforcing it with maybe articles we want to read on similar topics or whatever it is. And then I think we end up not then looking at other information. So, I mean, I think I'm seeing that more and more. I mean, and I think we've had this we've talked about this in other episodes, but I'm even seeing it with patients where they'll, see something with maybe a symptom or set of symptoms, and then they find everything they can in their life that confirms that they may have a certain diagnosis. And a lot of that's, again, it's kind of social media driven. So I think I'm seeing it there more heavily, but I think it's all over. How about for you?
Well, and the way you're putting that, like the term manufactured confirmation bias. And that's really what these algorithms are,
right,
or these targeted ads. And it's trying to, it becomes this echo chamber back where we're hearing our own belief systems, or we're getting the validation without really recognizing that it's only a very narrow view based off what's being given to us. So that's an interesting
You're going to coin that term, manufactured confirmation bias. No, but I do think that that's happening now. I mean, I think it's, we know that exists. I mean, we know that, our what we like and what we believe, social media algorithms know how to reinforce that. I mean, not even social media, even just my news feed. If I read a few food articles, I'm going to get 10 other food articles, right? It continually goes with my interests. So, maybe this confirmation bias is even more concerning when it's not even just our own seeking of information, but we have media that also confirms our biases.
And I think this ends up being so divisive, especially with certain topics. And so, politics is one of the bigger ones that come to mind. And, when we are thinking of whether it's elections or those uncomfortable conversations that happen typically at every family holiday, at least personally, I know that happens. Sure. And this idea of opposing belief systems, how can you even think about that? Or, what are you thinking? And how can you not see it in my way? And then when someone does agree, it's like, oh, this person is finally talking some sense without really ever hearing truly the other side in that unbiased way. And so, I think and kind of looking at that definition again, discounting information, and certainly with those areas that we can really attach ourselves in terms of identity or the roles that we play. I think that trying to then discount information that goes against that, because if we don't do that, then we might start to break down this idea of like, oh, I view myself as a Democrat or I view myself as a Republican.
Right.
How much of that is just because I'm not actually listening to what the other side has to say?
Well, I think that's probably the key, right? Is that we avoid or we kind of discount the fact that there's other opinions. And yeah, I think back to being kind of an early grad student, and I don't remember kind of when in my education it happened, but one of the, I think probably best conferences I ever went to was an APA conference, and I happened to go to this panel discussion that was about psychotherapy. And they had, and I don't remember who all the panelists were, but essentially there was a cognitive behavior therapist, there was a short-term dynamic therapist, there was a Gestalt therapist, and probably 6 or 7 people. And they all had differing and incredibly strong opinions, but that wasn't what I remembered. What I remembered was the fact that they all heard each other, and at the end started talking about their similarities more than their differences. And for me, it was pretty eye-opening, because I was like, wow, this is what real debate looks like. We have opinions, we argue our opinions, we put forth everything that we want to share. But the other part was listening and letting our own knowledge expand because of somebody else's knowledge. And I think that's where confirmation bias gets in the way. And you mentioned politics, and I check myself all the time. Like I always kind of go, man, if I'm getting emotional about something, I'm probably not listening to the other piece of it. There's an echo chamber of thoughts that are going on in my head that's just polarizing my view. And so it's a check for me where I go, all right, I'm going to read the counter argument to this. And I always find it really balances for me. Like at the end, I'll read it. Even if I don't agree with the counter argument, I go, all right, there's another side to the story. And so I think that keeps me, it doesn't necessarily always change my thought completely, but it gives me a better balance in my view, I guess.
And so maybe an idea of, how do we become aware of and even try to challenge the confirmation bias is like, do we understand the opposition and understanding it in some ways without judgment, and then letting that judgment come secondary to a fuller understanding of what the topic is that we're talking about, rather than those pre-existing or preconceived ones that we're trying to really kind of reinforce, or that allow our side of it to be right rather than just different.
Yeah. And I don't even know and maybe this is really spreading things too thin. I'm not even sure we have to fully understand the other argument. I think we have to hear it. And I mean, there's arguments that I hear that I'll respect, but I don't necessarily always understand them completely. But it allows me to at least respect that there is another opinion, and to hear that opinion. And even that little bit of just listening, I think, takes us from these far extremes in our thoughts. I think it brings us at least a little bit closer to the middle sometimes. So, yeah, I mean, I do think we just have to listen sometimes to other information.
And, it reminds me of just so many different times in the therapy setting when someone's coming in and someone's sharing their story. And, and so often, my listening, that's my first role. So,
right.
So I'm just wanting to be a listener and hearing their experience, whatever that may be. And certainly if the confirmation bias is there and, I know what this is, or, I already know where this is going.
Yeah.
It takes away from that respect piece and being able to hear it in its entirety. And then us coming to that joint decision rather than, me 10 words in deciding, this is where we're going with this conversation.
Right.
And it ends up, if I think, especially as clinicians, if we can recognize how we're taking that confirmation bias into the session and we can work to challenge it and focus in on that listening piece, it makes us better clinicians.
Yeah. And I think it's something important also to teach people we work with. I many times I'll have, a conversation with someone where they're on that kind of strong path. And, I just had a recent one with an adolescent who's having conflict with a teacher at school. And, the teacher in this individual's eyes is the worst teacher in the world. And I said, I made the comment, I said, wouldn't it be interesting to find times when she's not the worst teacher in the world? Like, have you heard any, can we find some information or heard any information about, people that like this individual, that think she's a good teacher? And it was, the student quickly was like, well, it's just the smart kids like her. I'm like, but then she's not the worst teacher in the world if some people like her, let's just break that kind of thought. But it was interesting because we were talking about, I said, you tend to find and want to talk to the teacher about everybody who agrees with you. And, and we even, I think I even called out the fact that you find ways to confirm the fact that she's a terrible teacher. Let's look on the other end of that. Like, can we expand our thinking? And it was an interesting conversation. I'm not sure. We'll have to see how far this goes and if it's therapeutically valuable, but it at least put a question mark that, that there's more to the story than it's just this person's a bad teacher. So I think we can use it with clients all the time.
Yeah, I think just expanding awareness and developing that, hey, let's not make these absolute judgments of the worst teacher in the world, but rather,
right,
maybe this is the worst teacher for me. And how different is that? When we're making judgments, and, individual experience might not be that different, but it can also then say, what's my role versus what's the teacher role? Because if they're the worst teacher in the world, nothing you can do about that. But if they're the worst teacher for me, well, then what is it about me that I'm bringing into this that's making it, this conflict? So certainly, just that small challenging there can offers a lot more flexibility than the all or nothing of, yeah, no, you're right. She's the terrible teacher.
Right. And but I think this is where these biases, all of them that we're going to talk about kind of come in. Like we see them in the therapy room all the time. It's, and I think confirmation bias is probably the most prominent and probably what most people will kind of go, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah. Well, and, with that, maybe let's talk about some of the other ones that maybe people are a bit less familiar with. And the next one that we're really wanting to jump into is this idea of the anchoring bias.
Okay.
And so when we're talking about that, anchoring bias is the tendency to heavily rely on or anchor on the first piece of information that you learn or on one specific trait. So in other words, it's the first piece of information that has the substantial impact on our judgment. And then any information that comes later on, especially that has a challenging or differing view of that, we tend to offer less value to or give less significance. And again, I think it's certainly prominent in so many areas. And I think this is also the bias that I've heard referred to as the first impression bias as well.
Right.
And so, that what a common phrase, you want to leave a good first impression. And there's a bias because of it. And so, Ray, what's your experience with the anchoring bias, and how have you seen it in your life?
Yeah, I think that this can, again, it's one of these ones I think we see across the areas. I mean, I think if we think just kind of maybe in everyday life, I think we see it a lot in marketing and in sales, and where you'll see somebody price something really high, and then anything that is priced at a lower rate, people think have lesser value. I mean, I think there are clothing brands that are brilliant with this. I'm not sure they're better clothes, but their name is associated with high prices. That becomes the anchor. So if you see another shirt that could be better quality, but is, instead of $50, it's $25, you somehow believe that that's, a lesser quality shirt, when in fact they both probably cost the same to make. But it's just a marketing tool. So, I mean, I think we see it in that. I think we see it a lot, even clinically. I think it's one that I'm very aware of when we do diagnosis and we're doing evaluations. Just mainly because I think it's easy to focus on the initial symptoms that somebody presents. So they come in and our first question is, why are you here to see us? What brought you into for this appointment? And so they're going to list the most prominent symptoms first, and we kind of anchor there. And I think sometimes that results in us maybe discounting other evidence that might lead to a more accurate diagnosis. I've thought about this with ADHD a lot, because I think, that's what people come in and they, I can't focus, I'm distracted, I'm restless, and all of those symptoms that we all associate with ADHD. But if we kind of anchor there, I think sometimes we miss the fact that depression and anxiety and just life can sometimes make us have all of those symptoms. And then we see a misdiagnosis in the end. So I think we could see it in different areas. I mean, those are kind of two I can think of.
Well, and I think not only in diagnostics, but in treatment as well. And, if we only, or not we, if I only focused in on that initial concern that someone had when they walked in, then that is going to be a very skewed perception, because oftentimes in the intake process, it becomes this like semi-formal and like exchange of information, which I don't think always offers an opportunity for there to be a full understanding of the person and the kind of the scope of things that we're operating with. And so even that, I think, if we're anchoring to that initial, this is the concern, then the next time someone comes walking in, I'm like, all right, let's hit this heavy. And if they're feeling disconnected from that initial session, then we might not be working, I might not have the full picture, and I might not be able to work and attend to all the different complex areas and kind of seeing how it all interconnects and relates. So I am thinking of an individual whom came in for, she was really struggling with just a lot of relational anxiety. And, as we're talking about it, then in comes trauma, then in comes, making decisions past in her life for everyone else but herself. And so, in relationships, feeling very insecure, but very much, impacted by those formative experiences in her, in her development that there was trauma with, and that there's a strong trauma association with, and as well as, these pressured decisions that she's made later on in her life, and leaving her feeling like she doesn't have much of a voice. And so to kind of only focus in on the relationships would be doing her a disservice. And if we're able to kind of step back away from that, or maybe kind of pull the anchor up a little bit, if I'm running with the metaphor, we're able to cover a lot more ground, and we're able to really kind of go into more in depth on the areas that feel significant in those moments, but also then being able to be mindful of all the waters that we've traveled.
I think that's a great kind of example. I'm kind of, as you were talking, it had me thinking about a whole bunch of other things here. But are there ways that these biases are used in a positive way in therapy? It's interesting. I was, for some reason, as you were kind of talking, I was thinking like, is there a value sometimes when we maybe present a higher level of what someone needs to do to solve a problem, and then present one that is maybe a little less difficult as a way for them to at least start the treatment process? Like, is that a way that we're using a cognitive bias in a positive way? Like, it sounds a little manipulative to me, but it also is sometimes, I think that, is that what, when we're providing those options and saying, well, here's one option, or here's another option. It makes me think of an infomercial. This is $100, but today it's $89.99 or whatever it is. But I guess we're talking about these as problematic, but are there ways therapeutically that we can use them to maybe help motivate people? Or do you think I'm off on that?
Because I think, and if I'm thinking about my concept of these cognitive biases, innately, there's not a negative intention behind them. It's, it's the simplification, or it's this, we're trying to pull on, we are such complex beings, and
right.
I think we only kind of ever present a fraction of that at a given time. And so it's a way that all of that, the past experience, present, sensory inputs, the cognitive process, all of that can kind of be distilled down and make sense of it through these biases. And so being able to not look at it as, biases are always negative, but rather biases are something that is present. And if we can be aware of it, we get to then determine the impact that they have. And so I didn't really think of it in those terms the way you were talking about it. But when I'm talking with individuals and we're trying to kind of talk about generating change, the first thing that I will always go to is actually, so we can continue to do what you're doing now, but that's not really working, is it? And it just kind of anchors in on this, this idea
of
where
it's at.
This isn't working. And I think I really try to, because that's why we're talking about it. It's because you don't so what are the other options? And it, if we can pull up that anchor from that one, it gives that freedom of mobility. But I think exactly what you're saying, we have to kind of first lock ourselves in one area first to be able to make it effective. And kind of, we have to use the anchoring bias to then challenge the anchoring bias rather than not let it be there at all.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, again, I kind of came out of my thoughts here was just, I never present interventions to people from the easiest to hardest. I always give them what the hardest is first, right? So it's not like, oh, you could do relaxation on your own every day for the next few weeks, or you can do this and it's, maybe it's a higher level situation. I kind of always start and go, all right, here's one option, but you also have these other options, and they tend to be some that are maybe more manageable. And as I do it, I think I do it purposefully as a motivation. And sometimes people go, no, let's go all in. I'm going for the hardest first. And some say, no, it'll be easier if I try maybe this one thing first, but then it lets us build momentum. So, I do think keeping in mind that these can be used therapeutically in a positive way, I think is important.
Yeah. And makes me think in terms of going back to the confirmation bias. What are some of the positive uses of that therapeutically, if there's any? And there's not any that jump to mind initially, but to kind of go back into that headspace and thinking about, our belief systems, because if we're thinking more beliefs rather than kind of decision making, it can be valuable to, if I have a belief system that I am thinking about values and morals, if I'm a hard worker or if I'm this, then that could be motivation. And, if we can kind of pull on those pieces, if it doesn't really hurt anything to say, let's think about all the times you haven't been a hard worker. Let's think of all the times you haven't been, this person. But if that's not really the area that we're looking to change, we can kind of use that to fuel the fire of motivation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's possible. I think the confirmation bias is probably a little harder sometimes, but I do think in that way, I mean, we do see people that, let's just use for depression as an example. Somewhere at some point, I had somebody tell me, depression is like wearing blue sunglasses. Everything starts looking blue and you start finding everything that kind of confirms it. So I do think we can kind of work with that when we're trying to get people to find these other good events in their life. It does go in reverse direction, I think, therapeutically.
Yeah. And, I don't know that the same will be true for all of the biases that we're talking about, but it'd be an interesting thought to keep in mind to say hey, well, again, can we look at this from a non-bias? Can we be non-biased against biases and, try to look at the positives as well as some of the negative impacts they have?
Yeah. I think the marketing world does that well. I mean, I remember from, kind of just a social psychology class and biases being talked about. And, in some way we see plays on that in the marketing world to try to get us to, believe that their product's a great product. I mean, is that always great? And can it go too far? Absolutely. But on a certain level, they sometimes, like I said, I guess I keep going back to motivation. I think sometimes we can use them as motivators, and they're not always necessarily harmful. Awareness of them is important.
Yes.
I think that maybe that goes back to the key, because if we're not aware that they happen, that's when it becomes problematic.
Yeah, I think awareness ends up being a really important theme here. And I'm expecting that we're probably going to see it playing a role, throughout all of these biases. And, as we've kind of called out at the very beginning, we're looking to have this be a multi-part episode. And Ray, I think here's a good point to start pulling back and wrapping things up for this episode. And we're going to look to continue the conversation, continuing to talk about, more different types of biases that are out there, and not only focusing in on the cognitive biases, but I think we're wanting to jump in on some social biases as well. So we hope you enjoyed this episode, and certainly we'll be back next week. Be well and stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psyched to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional-patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.